Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first meeting of 2026. A particularly warm welcome to any new members attending their first meeting of our club. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Rosie Waine. Rosie is a fashion historian and a curator. She has a PhD in history from the University of Southampton. Rosie specialises in the history of tartan. Yikes, I forgot to put on my tartan brooch. The history of tartan, Highland dress, and the material world of Jacobitism. Her research also explores romanticised representations of Scotland and Scottishness within contemporary media. Rosie was the William Grant Foundation Research Fellow at the National Museum of Scotland, which included co-curating the major exhibition, which some of you might have seen, Wild and Majestic, Romantic Visions of Scotland, and also her book, Highland Style, Fashioning Highland Dress, about 1745 to 1845. Rosie was also on the advisory committee for the major exhibition Tartan at the V&A in Dundee. So I now invite Rosie to address us on her topic this evening, Tartan in the Age of Scott. Rosie.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak this evening. I'll just dive right in. So, outside of his literary works, Sir Walter Scott is perhaps best known as one of the stage managers behind George IV's controversial visit to Edinburgh in 1822, also known as the so-called plaided panorama. It was the first time a reigning monarch had set foot in Scotland since the 17th century, and is often portrayed as the single most influential event in the rise of clan tartanry, with all the pomp and circumstance that entails. At the time, the refashioned mode of Highland dress adopted for the visit by the attendees and organisers, even by the king himself, raised questions of historical authenticity and cultural appropriation, an opinion that continues to linger in the popular imagination. It is easy to view the birth of modern Highland dress culture through this largely negative lens, and to see the costume we now know as an invented as opposed to a living tradition. So the period of Highland dress history that coincided with Scott's life and work is often interpreted as overly formal and prescriptive, and in some ways it was. The turn of the 19th century saw the rise of Highland dress etiquette, so an evolving set of rules on how and when it could be worn, what material should be used in its construction, and most importantly, who had the right to wear it. Such considerations would form the basis for the Victorian approach to elite Highland dress culture, which filtered through to the broader British public through a combination of royal approval, so Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, Balmoral, and modern consumerism, so the rise of boutique style Highland dress retailing via mail ordering catalogues and department stores. So the early 19th century was also the era of antiquarian debate and exploration of Highland dress history, when various authors sought to carve out a definitive origin story for the garb. So what came first, the great kilt or the trews? Did an Englishman invent the philibeg? Can we credit the Romans? So such attempts to demystify Highland dress and its historical pedigree did actually muddy the waters further. It generated more scepticism. In extreme cases, it did indeed create forgeries, such as the Vestiarium Scoticum, the much maligned work of the Sobieski Stewart brothers, published in the 1840s, and which claimed ancient roots for the clan tartan system. On the other side of the coin, this period also saw bursts of refreshing flexibility and experimentation. So as a living tradition, Highland dress has always evolved to suit the culture of the moment. This ability to adapt is an integral aspect of its survival, and why now, well into the 21st century now, Highland dress continues to change, it continues to evolve. So it's easy to pigeonhole Highland dress as just a national costume, but now, as in the 18th and 19th centuries, it exists on the same stage as broader British fashion and shouldn't be seen as separate from or unaffected by it. So, in the Age of Scott, Highland dress was considered both old and new. It was rooted in the material history of Scotland's past, while at the same time being actively shaped by its present. So my talk to you this evening explores that fascinating juxtaposition, fascinating in my opinion, using a range of objects from the collections of National Museums Scotland. Between 2018 and 2023, I led a project at the museum to research and reinterpret its impressive holdings of tartan and Highland dress. It is a truly wonderful collection, including textiles, costume, weaponry, visual and archival material, ranging in date from the late 1600s through to the present day, which we can use to document the many uses and transformations of Highland dress over the centuries. Many of these start pieces from this collection date from the later 18th and early 19th centuries, when Highland dress as we recognise it today began to take shape against the broader backdrop of British military expansion, European romanticism and Highland cultural revival. So let's start by examining this magnificent portrait from the NMS collection. So it's currently on display at the museum in the Scotland Transformed Gallery if you'd like to go see it. So the man depicted is William Cumming, Piper to the Laird of Grant. Painted in 1714 by Richard Waite, this portrait is a prime example of the significance placed on Highland dress within Gaelic display culture of the early 18th century. It highlights the legacy of the medieval custom of clan chiefs to employ retainers, so fighting men, musicians, historians and bards, as well as the social and cultural value invested in the clothing and arming of these specific individuals. Cumming's portrayal is quite a faithful representation of what a retainer would have worn at this date, and it's no coincidence that his weapons, including a dirk, worn in quite prominently in the middle there, broadsword and a targe on his back, as well as his fine clothing. They've all been made the focal points of the image. They're meant to draw the eye. So one of several retainer portraits known to have been commissioned by the Laird, this painting would have hung prominently within Castle Grant. The purpose of these portraits was to communicate to visitors the status of the clan within the region, not only in terms of their martial power, but also their material sophistication and wealth. The tartan worn by Cumming is similar to that worn by sitters in the other portraits in this series, implying a kind of proto-clan or livery tartan did exist in some form or other, even at this early date. I will not say clan tartans existed at this time because of this painting. Others have, but I do not. The luxurious fabrics used to fashion the belted plaid and the heavily decorated coat would have been part of Cumming's wages from the Laird for his services to the clan chief, with the tartan likely supplied by a weaver operating in the local vicinity of Castle Grant. At the time Cumming's portrait was made, this incarnation of clan society was in a state of transition, and such displays of feudal power were fast becoming relics of history. It was paintings such as this, hung in the ancestral houses of Highland families, which provided inspiration for later generations in their quest to revive traditional Highland culture at the turn of the 19th century. Meanwhile, by the mid-1700s, on the wider national stage, the wearing of Highland dress and of tartan specifically had become a more overtly political act. So while it continued to be an expression of regional culture and a kind of martial Highland masculinity, it was also increasingly used to convey anti-union and pro-Jacobite sentiments. So one of the few suits of Highland dress to survive from this period was owned by a prominent Jacobite, Sir John Hind Cotton. He was a big guy. as you might be able to tell from this picture. He's thought to have commissioned or been gifted this outfit during a visit to Edinburgh in 1744. As an Englishman and Tory MP with links to the exiled Stuart court in Rome, it seems clear that his acquisition of the costume reflected his support for the Jacobite cause. He was not alone in this. While little of the actual physical costume survives, there is plenty of visual and archival evidence to show the important role ascribed to tartan by followers of the Stuarts, particularly Bonnie Prince Charlie, particularly in that final rising of 1745 to 6. The Dress Act, introduced by the British government following the defeat of the Jacobite army at Culloden in 1746, prescribed the use of Highland dress by Scottish civilian men and boys. And it remained on the statutes for almost 40 years. Until its repeal in 1782, those caught and convicted of wearing the garb were at risk of fines, imprisonment, or transportation abroad to a British penal colony. Though enforcement of the act was definitely inconsistent, particularly once the threat of Jacobitism had diminished from the mid-1750s onwards, its very existence positioned Highland dress as notorious in the popular imagination. The Dress Act contained a significant exemption. Highland dress could still be worn by those serving in the ranks of the British Army. This aspect of the legislation brought the costume into state service during a period when Scottish regiments were being sent all over the world on various campaigns to fight and to colonise. Turning the costume into a military emblem of a burgeoning imperial power impacted not only what Highland dress symbolised culturally, that popular phrase from rebel to hero, but also what it looked like physically. So many of the elements which distinguished it as a martial costume in the early modern Gallic society remained integral to the military uniform. So especially the accoutrements like the dirk, the sporran and the broadsword, as well as the belted plaid or great kilt, philomore as it's also known. Yet now these sat alongside the regimental redcoat and decorations of the British Army. This emergent style was seen as definitively Scoto-British, so rather than uniquely Highland. It was during these years that the costume acquired its status as a signifier of patriotism through military service, which many saw as a reflection of Scotland's growing foothold within the modern Union. When the Dress Act was finally lifted in 1782, thanks to the concerted lobbying of Scottish gentry in London, this regimental aspect had become thoroughly ingrained within Highland dress culture and heavily influenced how the dress was tailored, worn and styled by civilians in the decades that followed. Beyond the battlefield, the influence of early Romantic literature, notably Macpherson's Ossian and later Scott, and increased travel to and within the Highland region fueled external fascination with the costume, effectively underscoring the status of Highland dress as a kind of cultural curio. We can see this new level of interest reflected in these two dress prints, depicting a Highland gentleman and lady in full costume, captioned with detailed descriptions of their garments and habits. So these appeared in the publication A New Geographical Dictionary by John Barrow. It was published in 2 volumes between 1759 and 1760, and Barrow's dictionary contained more than 140 engravings, including maps, perspective views of places, structures, and ancient ruins, as well as several plates depicting the traditional costumes of various regions around the world. Although Barrow's dictionary contained detailed maps of Scotland, Ireland, England, and Wales, only the regional dress of the Scottish Highlands was described and illustrated in any detail. So that really does show how interested people were in this and in no other regional dress or custom in Scotland, in Britain at that time. Just as tourists came to the Highlands in greater numbers to explore the landscape and observe the customs of its people, members of the Highland aristocracy increasingly ventured further abroad, moving back and forth with the tide of the social season in particular. So this brought Highland costume to the assembly rooms, theatres and pleasure gardens of London and of Edinburgh, even to the royal court. So the sons of George III, for instance, were known to adopt Highland dress at masquerades and were early patrons of aristocratic Highland clubs and societies. Such groups began to emerge during the late 1770s, their stated aim being to preserve and promote aspects of Highland cultural life deemed in danger of decline. So because of its prescription, it was deemed in danger of declining, so they wanted to bring it back with the repeal better than ever. So this quite beautiful tartan coat belonged to a member of one such club, the Highland Society of London, who were responsible for the repeal movement of the 1780s. This particular coat dates from the 1810s. Its use coincides with quite an interesting chapter in the club's history that saw its members investigating Highland dress origins and curating a collection of clan tartan samples that they solicited from chiefs all over the Highlands. And they also patronised antiquarians and artists who were interested in the garb as well. Note the inventive way that the tailor has manipulated the set of the tartan. This is so thoroughly modern. You can see it particularly along the seams of the coat, on the back especially. It creates this kaleidoscope of interlocking diamonds. And the lighter white and yellow stripes in the tartan have been woven in silk. So can you just imagine how beautiful that would have looked under the candlelight of the time, just picked out in that kind of detail, especially when you consider the thistles that are embroidered in the collar are done with like metal threads. So it was very luxurious, very beautiful. The set of the tartan, you might recognise it, it's the Royal Stuart, and it reflects the level of royal patronage that the club was receiving at this point in time. So the sons of George III, for instance, were presidents of this club. They went to meetings, they joined in with the whole thing. So this was also the period when Highland dress began to move more closely align with standards of male tailoring in the rest of Britain. So by the early 1800s, menswear was more countrified in style and it was more athletic in cut and construction. If Highland dress had not become more aligned with these standards of British male tailoring and styling, I do believe it's unlikely it would have survived. This was a time of great experimentation in Highland dress when the silhouette was reshaped to fit the needs and expectations of the modern wardrobe. So unfortunately I didn't include a slide of this, but you have inside kilts of this period things like pockets for fob watches and stuff like mimicking the use of pantaloons at the time, that kind of thing. So it's very much moving with the styles of the time, so as not to be left behind. A suit of Highland dress of this calibre was deemed quite a luxury commodity in Britain, worn mainly at special occasions as a way of indicating the Scottishness of the wearer. Now, more than ever before, it became known as a national as opposed to a purely regional mode of ceremonial dress. So case in point, this is just one of several costumes in the NMS collection that was worn at the 1822 visit. The suit belonged to a man called William Blackhall of Blackfolds, West Lothian. Blackhall was just one of many Lowlanders who decided to don Highland dress during the festivities, treating the outfit as an emblem of national rather than regional identity. He was also not a man of great stature either, like he was a cone maker working in London. So he didn't have a huge amount of money, but he wanted to join in. And because he was involved in the textile trade, it has been speculated that maybe he got access to the tartan through these connections. So through its myriad military and romantic associations, Highland dress had been elevated to the status of this patriotic ceremonial costume within broader Scottish society, not only within the Highlands, a status that intensified tenfold with the arrival of the monarch in Scotland. It's one of my favourite outfits from the NMS collection, not only because it can be associated with the 1822 visit, got good provenance, but because it isn't red. Red-based tartans were extremely popular throughout the 18th and 19th century, using luxurious dye stuffs like imported cochineal from Mexico. Whereas you'll see this one is not red, it's green and blue based, so it's using cheaper dye stuffs. But I think it's more the richer for that. It's got such a beautiful density. So, in particular, the red tartans that I mentioned, the Royal Stuart, so popular. Whether you had any connection to Scotland at all, a Royal Stuart plaid was in your back pocket. You know? So yes, having a suit of blue and green is really refreshing. It's made from 2 tartans, actually, in this colour range. The jacket and waistcoat are the Glenorchy pattern, and the kilt and plaid are the Cumming. So there's no familial reason for Blackhall to have chosen these 2 specific patterns, meaning that his choices were probably driven just by his own personal taste, his own liking, as opposed to a clan affiliation. So that really does show the way that clan tartans have become subsumed into this broader fashionable culture of luxurious consumption. Of course, it wasn't only men who engaged with the emerging aesthetics of Scottish Romanticism. This quite fantastic silk gown dates from the 1830s. You can tell because of the really crazy puffed sleeves. And it was part of the wedding trousseau of Sarah Justina Davidson of Tulloch. The choice of tartan and the botanical details that are embroidered along the hem of the gown are a reference to the emerging Highland heraldry at the time, so things like clan badges as well as tartans. And they were in reference to her new husband's family. So it shows how she's using this emerging sense of a Highland identity through dress in the joining of her family to her husband's. It's really quite beautiful as a garment, emotionally as well as physically. It makes quite a striking contrast to the traditional arisade, which was worn by Highland women during the 18th century, and was beginning to fall out of fashion by the turn of the 19th, but was still quite common. So you have this wonderful fashion piece on one side, and then on the other side, the more practical, everyday thing. It's a white-based tartan, and it would have been used as a garment, but also as bedclothes. Like when it wasn't suitable to be worn out of the house anymore, you could throw it over your bed. Like it's that kind of thing. And one of the things I really love about this, and many of the other arisades that are in the collection, is it's marked. So it's embroidered with the initials of the woman who wore it and who had it as part of her household of textiles. So these were very personal objects, which were very much a part of the family life. And might explain why intergenerationally they do survive. They don't get thrown away, they get kept. So this particular example, it dates from around the 1770s. So it's not the earliest that exists, but it is a very fine example. Children, too, were brought into this new chapter of Highland Style. This is a very rare example of early Highland Style clothing for children, and it dates from around 1815. So it's very patriotic, as well as having a slight Jacobitism about it. The tartan is the Prince Charles Edward tartan. So it was becoming very popular at the time that Jacobitism was becoming highly historicised into novels and poems and songs at the time. So there isn't a familial reason for this tartan to be worn. It's very much a reflection of the fashionable interest in Highlandism at this time. So there aren't that many outfits that survive, which give this impression of what children were wearing and how their parents wanted to dress them. This particular one is one of the earliest, and we think it's probably from a toddler. It's like a 2-3-year-old. There are some portraits which exist of young children wearing these and how they're supposed to be worn. So you can see in this one over here, he's got the full Glengarry bonnet, he's got the little sporran, he's got the brogues and the diced hose. So there are, I believe, 3 paintings which exist which show this style, as well as some fashion plates as well, which appeared in like Ackerman's Repository of Arts, which was a really popular ladies' magazine at the period. So yeah, I do love this. As a recent mother myself, I love this. One of the other things which is nice about it is the braiding at the top and the domed buttons is a reflection of military uniform, just broadly, being worn at the time, that was made popular in British fashion because of the Napoleonic Wars. So yeah, they were being dressed as what I like to think of as little emblems of the nation at a time when it really mattered to some families. I'm just going to do a quick time check here. Okay, we're good. So finally, let's talk about tartan itself, in particular the emergence of the clan tartan system during the Age of Scott. So there tends to be 2 camps in the clan tartan debate. Either they're seen as an invented tradition, completely fabricated by the Victorians, or they're presented as this ancient reality, steeped in the mists of time. The truth, however, is somewhere in the middle. The origins of the modern clan tartan movement can be traced to the commercialisation and large-scale production of tartan that emerged in Scotland during the mid to late 18th century, in response to the use of tartan by the British Army, as well as the effect that the repeal of the Dress Act in 1782 had upon the broader civilian marketplace. So tartan was never banned under the Dress Act. It was Highland Dress specifically, as well as some garments that were made from tartan, but tartan itself was woven and it was worn in Scotland, just to a much lesser degree. But taking the lid off by doing the repeal, just suddenly it became so much more desirable, so much more interesting as a cultural commodity. The concept of clan tartans really came to the fore amid a wave of experimentation in tartan design and marketing in the wake of the repeal, and it lasted conservatively from the 1780s through to the 1830s. So this experimentation reflected a commercial urge to appeal to as wide a cross-section of customers as possible, as well as a desire on the part of manufacturers to refine what had swiftly become a popular, versatile product. Whereas tartans woven for use in military uniform had to conform to quite strict regimental specifications, those produced for the public were subject both to the creativity of the weaver and the changing tastes of the purchaser. So you have consumer driving demand, consumer driving change and innovation. And that's something I think that was really lost in the tartan scholarship of, say, early to mid 20th century, when it was more about figuring out what are the origins of a specific pattern, when did it come about, and not so much about why is someone making this? Why do they want it? What was the specific reason of the person who commissioned the weaver to do this? So the process of tartan design and manufacture was quite fluid. It was quite reactionary, with patterns often named or renamed to reflect the trends of each passing season, so reflecting the fashion season of the day. So changing on sometimes once, sometimes twice yearly basis. Set names, so set is another word for a pattern, echoed popular interest in specific places, people, and events. That was very commonplace. For example, tartans christened after Scottish towns and districts were sold alongside more transitory, commemorative and celebratory sets. So things like the Waterloo, the Regent, the Walter Scott pattern. Very, very common. And some of those celebratory and commemorative patterns ended up being turned into clan patterns because of the people who were wearing them, because of the families that adopted them. So it was during this period that tartan naming conventions became more closely tied to the performance of a kind of personal and collective identity. In the decades following the repeal of the Dress Act, sets were increasingly styled to reflect the identity of the customer who first commissioned them or who ordered them most frequently. So this could lead to the same pattern being recognised under different monikers at different times. So a set claimed by the Macphersons as a clan pattern in the 1810s. Previously it was known as the Kid, after an earlier 18th century purchaser, and then as the Caledonia, as a nod to patriotism and more romantic Scottish culture. The choice and arrangements of colours within a tartan design were largely made by the firm that supplied it, though not always. Such choices could also come at the direct request of the purchaser. So, as evidenced in the surviving documents of the tartan weaving company Messrs Wilson of Bannockburn, a minority of customers took the kind of unusual step of submitting meticulously annotated diagrams of their desired sets, which is what you can see here, to ensure they received exactly what they wanted and not a design off the peg. So this particular drawing here, it was submitted by Sir Patrick Crawford Bruce in 1811 to the weavers, Wilsons of Bannockburn, and it was an arduous process. This is just one page from a multi-page, multi-diagram discussion that went on for nearly 2 years of what he wanted his tartan to look like. He sent in swatches of fabric for his servants who were going to be wearing the fabric, saying they wear orange, they wear red, it's part of their livery, so can we make the tartan match that? Here are the fabrics. And then when the colours weren't right, they said, well, I've done you a watercolour. These are the colours that I want. This is the arrangement that I want. I don't know if he ever got what he wanted. His family papers survive in the Bodleian Library, and I can't find any mention of payment to Wilsons. So I don't think they ever got it right, which is kind of sad really when you consider how much effort he put in. Don't know if you can quite see, but here we have on the sides like scarlet, black, orange, white, orange, just all meticulously laid out. It's quite beautiful really. So, going back to what I was saying, while some fabricated their designs based on the needs of the moment, in the case of Bruce, he just purchased an estate in the Highlands. He was mainly in London for a lot of the time. He just joined the Highland Society of London, and he was kind of desperate to have a tartan that he could have his servants wear, have himself wear, to make good with his new friends in the Highland Society of London. I hope he did. I hope he got it right. So yes, some people designed them just off their own backs, and other people were looking into the past. They were going to paintings, they were going to artefacts, they were going to heirlooms in their family's broader keeping, and using them as inspiration, sending descriptions of them, samples of them to the weavers to say, can you recreate this? So in this manner, by the early 19th century, there was a growing number of designs that had begun to emerge within particularly Wilsons of Bannockburn's repertoire, which did have loose familial or clan affiliations, which then grew into what became the clan tartan system. An evolving antiquarian literature on the subject both supported and popularised the idea of clan tartans during the late Georgian and early Victorian eras. These publications include things like James Logan's The Scottish Gael, Logan and McKeon's The Clans of the Scottish Highlands, which have those absolutely gorgeous dress prints that you might see reproduced on postcards a lot, as well as William and Andrew Smith's authenticated tartans and the clans of the families of Scotland. And most controversially, given its highly dubious content and presentation, John Sobieski Stewart's Vestiarium Scoticum, which is still used today as among the standards of this is what the clan tartans are, do not deviate. So by the mid to late 19th century, the scholarship on clan tartans was inextricably bound to the production and retail of tartan itself, with those who dealt in the cloth increasingly working to quite a strict array of true patterns from which they were loath to deviate. The traditional clan tartan system, which evolved during this later period, as well as the rules of etiquette that accompany its use, continues to exercise considerable influence over the landscape of contemporary tartan and Highland dress today. So, to draw to a close now, I just want to reiterate that Highland dress culture is often perceived as being this quite fixed, unchangeable, perhaps stale symbol of Scottishness, which operates within its own sphere of influence. I hope this talk has challenged that idea for you slightly and demonstrated its quite dynamic, ever-changing nature. It's very much a part of fashionable culture, past and present, and like fashion itself, is constantly reacting to the needs and tastes of the moment. And if you'd like to know more about that, you may perhaps like to read my book, Highland Style. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rosie. And Rosie's kindly agreed to answer any questions. Yes, Ian.
Do we know if Scott himself ever at any stage wore tartan? I don't just mean 1822, and I ask because there used to be in existence a full-size figure, mannequin if you like, in the collection of Madame Tussauds, and she's supposed to have made this in Edinburgh in January 1828, I think, but Scott makes no record of this event, and the figure itself has melted, which is a terrible fate, for poor Scott, but I suppose it's a hazard of being a waxwork. But apparently a cast still survives in Madame Tussauds. Do we know if Scott at the royal visit ever was tempted to wear tartan? I don't think he did, but do we know?
Well, he was a founder member of the Celtic Society in Edinburgh, whose maxim was Highland dress preservation.
Yeah.
And in my research for this book, there is part of it that deals with the Celtic Society. I went through some very interesting newspaper accounts of the meetings of the Celtic Society, which do mention Scott wearing tartan. They don't go into a huge amount of detail. They basically say wearing the full fig of the Highland dress. So yes, I do believe he did wear tartan. I don't think he wore it quite as often as others.
Yeah, I know there are records of a lot of chiefs making their way to his house.
Yes.
I wondered whether he himself had succumbed to this. His Royal Company of Archers uniform would have been largely tartan because it was in the 1820s.
Yes.
And I wondered if there was any more civilian identity. The Tussauds mannequin is really remarkable because he has the traditional Highland weapons, the Doon pistols, the broadsword, and a sort of velvet coatee, the whole works.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that period in Highland dress, tailoring and accessories. Again, there's a bit in my book about it, which talks about some of the people who would supply those accoutrements in Edinburgh. There was a company called the Albion Cloth Company that would do the plaid brooches, they do the pistols, the broadswords, and they would supply the Celtic fancy dress ball that was hosted by the Celtic Society, obviously of which Scott was a member. So that doesn't surprise me at all that there is a waxwork inspired by that.
Thank you.
On that, he wore border check, didn't he?
Oh, well, yes.
Yes, it was that,
And
yes.
popularised it as soon as it became, and presumably...
Shepherd tartan.
Yes.
Yeah.
But sorry, my question was, at which point did tartan become associated with Scottishness generally, as opposed to, as it had presumably been up to the Second Jacobite uprising, 715 would be still seen as a Highland dress. And then at which point does it become associated with a Scottish form?
I would argue during the 17th century you see it kind of prominent from the point of the Stuarts starting to underscore their Scottishness as a reason for their claim. So you do get mentions of Jacobite supporters wearing it as a form of, the Stuart line is Scottish, this is a characteristically Scottish product, therefore I will wear it. It kind of becomes that dual Scottish Highland product at that point. It becomes more broadly Scottish, more with that repeal movement during the 1780s. I'd say before that point it is more skewed towards the Highland side of Scottish identity, but it does have that broader Scottish association before then. In particular, you see it in prints of the period. You see it used as a kind of visual shorthand to mainly satirical prints making fun of Scots. You'll see them having the plaid thrown over the shoulder of tartan, and these are prints which are contemporary to the 45 and earlier, which are just being used to be like, yeah, tartan, Scottish. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Where was it made? I mean, you have the rise of the border mills, so did you have the irony that Highland Dress was mainly being made in the lowlands, or were there?
Well, it wasn't so much mainly being made in the lowlands. So you do have there's a kind of, you have your weavers all over Scotland, and you have your Highland weavers, and you have weavers who are operating in the localities of particular places who will be doing tartans for their region. And then you'll have that broader commercialised tartan, which is being produced more in that lowland area. So it's not so much a uniform industry that's with one particular place during the 18th century. It's kind of spread out across the whole area. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Well, there weren't Highland mills there.
But it wasn't so much mills as we would understand them. It was more cottage industry based. So you'd have more people fulfilling orders on a more ad hoc basis, rather than people producing large-scale tartan in huge mills. That's more later 18th into 19th century. During the time of the Jacobite period and earlier, it was more on that cottage industry ad hoc basis.
Ian, I think you
Yeah. Thank you very much. When you just referred to cartoons, when one looks at the drawings of John Kay, he shows Highland gentlemen wearing kilts with heavy box pleats. And so my question is, when did box pleating give way to knife pleats, and the difference or the fashion of pleating to set and pleating to stripe?
So first, it's important, I think, just to mention that the philibeg, as we would understand it, the little kilt, was more introduced during the middle decades of the 18th century, and it was before that it was more the belted plaid, which you would make the pleats yourself, and you would put a belt and keep the pleats in place that way. The introduction of the tailored kilt with the pleating, it happened during these middle decades and became more regimented as it became more of a staple of military uniform. So you'd have more box pleating being introduced with regimental wear, and the pleating to stripe and to set was coming in later 18th into the early 19th century. The pleating to set and to stripe was a way of making use of the grid of the tartan in a way that was aesthetically pleasing. So, for instance, let's go back to the little jacket. So, you have more experimentation with the tartan grid going on, and that is filtered through to kilts in the production of the different types of pleating, where they will be using the grid in a different way to highlight different elements of the tartan pattern. Yeah. Knife pleating was going on at the same time as box pleating. One didn't really take over from the other. You see knife pleating more in civilian style kilts than you do in the military. The military are more the box pleating. And was there another part of your question?
No, that's it.
Yeah.
Very interesting, thank you.
If you're interested in the specific tailoring of Highland Dress, the final chapter of my book goes into exhausting detail. I didn't want to include it in case it would be too boring for people who weren't interested in textiles specifically, but we do have some very nice imagery that was taken for the book of early kilts, which are laid out so you can see that internal construction. There's one particular kilt from the 1790s that we have in the collection, which is a civilian kilt, not a military one, and there is no rhyme or reason to the pleating at all. It's terrible and doesn't make any use of the pattern whatsoever. So it shows just how much variation there was at the time. and how so much refinement happened in such a short period of time to make what we now know as that kind of Highland dress standard and kilt making standard.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Yes.
What is the etymology of the very word tartan?
Well, there's a lot of debate on that. Some say it's from the French, tartan, and some say it's from the Gaelic Brecon. I personally don't particularly know. I apologise, I do not know.
Hugh?
In the great talk, thank you very much indeed. In the Macpherson Museum, there's a picture of the Clooney Macpherson of the day, head to foot a Highland gentleman, except he's wearing a tweed kilt and tweed everything. What is the kind of relationship between tweed and tartan? Were they competing with each other?
I think it's, during the 19th century, I think you could say they were somewhat competing with each other. Earlier than that, not so much. When does this portrait date from, if you don't mind me asking?
I suspect late 19th century.
Yeah, so you start getting more tartan and tweed outfits existing in the same wardrobe during that time, based on the different activities you would be using it for. So you might get more tweed full outfits for more hunting activities, more outdoor activities like fishing, walking, hunting, that kind of thing. But you'd still have your full ceremonial Highland dress or your more in-between Highland dress. There's a really beautiful collection of portraits of the Balmoral retainers from, I believe it's the 1860s, which shows just the full range of different combinations of tartans and tweeds and full tweed outfits, full tartan outfits that was going on in the Balmoral estate during that later 19th century period. So again, people kind of think of Victorian era Highland dress as being very staid and formal and non-changing, but it also has this great variation based on fashion and use cases. And yeah, I think just as now, there was a competition between the sort of tartan and tweed makers that's kind of vying for the market. You do still see that, I would say, in 21st century fabric making.
Peter?
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I was particularly interested when you were talking about the letters which went out from the Highland Society of London to Scottish chiefs often to find out not just for a sample of the tartan, but they also wanted examples of family seals. They were also trying to drum up support for membership of the society. And I happened to be in the National Library a few months ago looking at some family papers and found replies from a number of clan chiefs to David Stewart.
I've seen them.
Have you seen them?
I have, they're wonderful.
The thing that struck me about them, many echoes of what you're saying, was the variety in how much the letter writers knew or didn't know about their family tartans. So you had someone like Ferguson of Invercourt, who said, "Oh no, my study is already lined, wallpapered with tartan." There was someone, Gordon Cumming family, who said they had no idea at all what their family tartan was. Others responded. There was a great enthusiasm, and particularly so soon after the Battle of Waterloo. I mean, one of the writers talked about the Scottish Highlander regiments had helped crush tyranny to atoms. It was a jolly good idea to make sure these tartans were being preserved. I thought that just the way in which Struan Robertson said something quite interesting about the origins of tartans. He said that it had never been ascertained that the clans had their own particular patterns, but he concedes they all had particular emblematic colours. And it just seemed these letters are all dated in 1815, and he's anticipating the arrival of the then Prince Regent, of course, who kept getting delayed for one reason or another. The visit didn't come to 1822. But the enthusiasm which was being shown by this initiative shines through in every single letter. There's only the only one that's the presence of the Royal Dukes you mentioned, and that the Dukes of York and Kent were very popular. Lord Mansfield, writing from Scone, writes that he didn't think there was much point in having a royal patron at all. It's the one note that seems less enthusiastic about that. But, thank you very much. That was fascinating.
I absolutely love those papers that you described. I looked at them myself for my book and an article that I'm working on as well. So chapter 2 of my book goes into detail about the Highland Society of London and all of the things that they were doing in their efforts to preserve and promote, which included that collection of clan tartan. And they started in 1815, and it kind of carried on for so long. We have that initial splurge of collecting and writing all these letters and getting all these different opinions back. But then there are different lives to the collection, which I think is less well known, because the club still exists today. It's still very much interested in tartan and tartan preservation. And their collection is on loan to the National Museum, and they've had it since the 1980s. And that whole collection spans that initial flurry to collect, as well as the repackaging of the collection in the early 20th century, where they cut the original collection to bits and then they framed it all into different books with all of these different research notes written along the edge, just to show how much the scholarship had come along since that first flurry of collecting. And yeah, it is really fascinating as a subject, so thank you for bringing it up. I love talking about that.
Maxwell.
I have seen a long time ago letters to the chief of the Clan MacLeod, sometime in the early 19th century, from a clans person asking what the tartan was for the MacLeods. And he was, it must be said, a somewhat anglicised chief. He wasn't particularly enthusiastic in his interests. And he said, I don't know, but we always just use the same one used by the Mackenzies.
Yeah.
Would that be a common kind of notion of clans sharing?
Yes, it definitely was. And actually it comes up in the papers that we were just talking about.
Exactly, same question.
Yes, you do definitely see that. In one of the letters we were just talking about, in Struan's letter, he talks about how he doesn't believe in clan tartans, doesn't think that they have any historical basis, but he wears, I think he says, the Murray of Athol because of the lands of his family. So implying it's less about, it's more about the land from which they come from, and those kind of ancient borders is how that he in particular is defining it. So that kind of that shared clan land, that shared ancestry idea is common in that period when they're trying to figure out what they should wear and why.
I wonder whether you could say something about kilt pins and their fashion, and whether they were originally practical, of going through the outer apron into the lower one, or well, most people today, I think, only have it through the upper apron. Is that just a fashion, or is there a continuity of use?
So you don't see kilt pins until the 19th century. They're definitely one of the aspects of Highland dress culture which grows out of the move of other accessories going from practical to decorative. So you see things like play brooches, dirks, skene doos, which did at some point have a more practical function, becoming really highly decorative. And then you get sort of suites of accessories being made and sold, which might include new fangled elements, such as the kilt pin. And that has just become subsumed into this changing culture of Highland dress, and it's still there. So one of the things that I did towards the end of my time at NMS was a contemporary collecting project to see what people are wearing now. And there was some wonderful variation in things like kilt pins, because they in themselves become a kind of expression of identity. So you have them like the clan ones, which are part of suites of clan crest things, which come out of the 19th century Victorian style of Highland dress. And nowadays you have things which are more broadly familial based or land based. There was a beautiful kilt pin that we collected by a maker in Dundee, which was made out of the wood from the whiskey barrels of her local distillery, and she had fashioned aspects of the silver work to represent the waterways of her location as well. So yes, kilt pins emerged as a fashion, and they are still a fashion. They are still very much changing and evolving as well.
Thank you. No practical use of going through both aprons.
I mean, yeah. Yeah, they do. They are practical for that. They're not necessary in a way, I would say.
Time for just one final question. Yes.
Is there any early examples of a possessiveness or even a resentment against others who started to adopt Highland dress or tartan?
Yes. Yeah. So particularly around the 1822 visit, a lot of the reporting of it had to do with this idea of cultural appropriation and the right to wear. And it's a debate which continues. There's also questions of, particularly in that right to wear category, of is it just the elites who should be wearing this, or should the more lower class, working class people who actually live on these areas, they should be the ones wearing it, not you. So yeah, it's a very vexed question, and it was then and it continues to be.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Rosie. Thanks so much, Rosie. And now I'd like to invite Lord Stewart, Angus Stewart, to offer the vote of thanks.
Madam Chair, it's a very great pleasure to propose the vote of thanks to Dr. Waine for this fascinating talk. Before I invite you to applaud, perhaps I can take us back to what for us, in a sense, is the beginning, Waverley. I've always thought it's curious how life and art imitate each other in the career of Scott. And one can find 3 examples in Waverley. First, in the novel Waverley, published of course in 1814, the fictional Baron Bradwarden fusses over his ancient Latin charter, which imposes the honourable duty of, quote, in translation, pulling off or removing the boots of the monarch after battle, which all of a sudden assumed fresh relevance following the encounter at Preston Pans. In real life, when George IV visited Edinburgh in 1822, all manner of ancient feudal honours, privileges and obligations contained in old parchments were researched, debated and even quarrelled over. Eventually, for example, Lord Francis Lewson Gore, second son of the Duchess of Sutherland, yielded to Francis Stuart, 10th Earl of Murray, the dignity of carrying the royal sceptre. The second example relates to Waverley, but also to Ivanhoe. In Ivanhoe, published in 1820, Scott's mysterious disinherited knight, Ivanhoe, refuses to lift his visor and reveal his identity to Prince John. So at that, quote, snug little dinner in 1815, when Walter Scott was entertained by the Prince Regent, Scott declined to identify himself as, quote, the author of Waverley. And the subtitle of Waverley, this is the third example, 1814, as I said, is of course, 'tis 60 years since, but Waverley is of course more than a retrospective. In the tartan-clad portrait of the Englishman Edward Waverley, the past becomes the present. The fictional Waverley in the novel preserved his Highland dress from 1746 throughout the period of prescription, and as at the date of publication, the real life present, as Scott spells out in the text, included Henry Raeburn's recently exhibited portrait of the kilted chief of Glengarry, Alistair Ranaldson MacDonald, a new genre of portrait painting, soon, in 1822, to become the template for Wilkie's magnificent likeness of King George IV. I can't resist mentioning the best witticism of that royal visit. There was a complaint that the king's kilt was too short for modesty, to which Lady Hamilton Dalrymple retorted, quote, "Since he is to be with us for so short a time, the more we see of him, the better." Madam Chair, all of us, I'm sure, have greatly enjoyed and become better informed by Rosie Waine's illustrated presentation on the subject of tartan, which is such an important part of our heritage and indeed of our identity. And I would like to thank the speaker, if I may, particularly for some beautiful illustrations which I haven't previously seen. It was a pleasure to be here this evening and to be addressed by such an expert in the field. Can I ask you please to applaud our speaker?
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Angus. Just before we go through for drinks, let me remind you about some upcoming club events. First, there are still a few places available for our excursion on 14th March to Scott's former home in North Castle Street. Tickets also still available for our talk next month by Dan Mulhall, the first ever Irish Consul General to Scotland and later Irish Ambassador to the USA, and also tickets available for our excursion to Blackie House. Further ahead, on the 7th May, we have our annual dinner, so please do have a look at the club website for further details of all these events and the booking form. Now, planning is underway for our colloquium on Scott's Journal. If you'd be interested in presenting a paper, please contact David McLeay, our club secretary. And finally, may I thank you all for your attendance this evening, and we'll now move through for drinks to the landing and the castle room. Thank you again.